For more than 30 years, the Australia Institute has been producing research that matters. But how do you turn big, bold ideas into positive change? In this series, I'm speaking to some of Australia's best thinkers about how we can make change for the better. I'm Paul Barclay, and this is What's the Big Idea? Brought to you by the Australia Institute. Today, I'm speaking with Maiy Azize, National Spokesperson for Everybody's Home, a campaign to fix Australia's housing crisis. Maiy is also the Deputy Director of Anglicare Australia. Hello, Maiy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, one of the big issues right now, the issue that everybody, I suppose, is talking about is the issue of how unaffordable housing is in Australia. Buying a home is out of reach for so many people. And research that you've done has found that essential workers can't even afford average rents anywhere in the country. Why has housing become so unaffordable for so many ordinary Australians, renting or buying? What are the causes of this crisis?
Well, I think how you define this issue and where you see the problem plays such an important role in what you think the solutions are. And for me, I think it's really instructive to look back on the time when Australia had really affordable housing to rent and to buy, because we didn't always have a housing crisis. In fact, I will just clarify, I do like to use the phrase housing crisis because in my opinion, it's really nothing short of a crisis for the people who are living on the front lines of it. That's the phrase they use, and so that's the phrase I use. But we haven't always had this housing crisis. We used to have really affordable homes to rent and to buy. And back in those days, the government's solution to housing affordability was a pretty simple one. It used to build homes and then rent them to people and also sell them to people. Right up until the early 80s, actually, 1 in 3 renters was renting from the government. And that was all sorts of different people. It was teachers, public servants, construction workers, you name it. All of those sorts of people used to rent from the government. And about 1 in 4 new constructions at the highest point was homes being built by the government. So quite a significant footprint. In the years and decades since, what you've really seen is the government, especially the federal government, step back from that. It's now just a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of new constructions that are being built as social housing. And it's a system now that's really become exclusively for people at the margins, and it's not even working for them. I mean, if you're someone who really needs social housing, you're going to wait years and years before you can get access to it. There's an enormous unmet demand for people who are in the most severe rental stress. And that's a problem because when you look around the world at the countries that are actually doing this well, the countries that have either avoided their housing crisis altogether or managed to turn it around, they are the countries where the government is a major supplier of housing. They are not countries that are leaving it entirely to the private sector.
Yeah, look, I'll just repeat those numbers because they're striking. At one point, 1 in 3 renters were renting from the government, and at the high point, 1 in 4 new homes were government built. And this was an era when housing was, of course, way more affordable, both to rent and to buy, to what it is now. The question then is, what happened since then, and how did we get to where we are now?
Well, we followed a similar trajectory to a lot of other countries. So after the Second World War, lots of governments, lots of countries began building public housing, began building social housing. And so we followed trends. We followed a lot of comparable international trends. In the 80s and 90s, a lot of comparable countries also started to walk away from social housing, walking away from the government providing housing. And we followed, again, a very similar trajectory. In the 80s was really when you started to see the federal government step back from providing housing. You started to see much more of a focus on things like Commonwealth rent assistance, subsidising people to be in the private rental market instead of actually providing homes directly. And then in the 90s, you saw, I guess, the darkest turn of all, which was the majority of money. The majority really underplays it. Just about all of the money we spend on housing these days is subsidising investors in one way or another. That's really where we're putting our money. That's what we've been doing since the late 90s and early 2000s, and I think we've seen really disastrous results.
And this is really a mirroring of essentially what the government's role in the economy has been more broadly under the kind of neoliberal arrangements, governments stepping back out of the economy, and in this instance, that's meant governments not owning or building homes, and that's led to handing that responsibility over to the market through tax incentives, and that's how we've reached the point that we are now.
Absolutely. And I mean, the thing that's a little bit baffling about it is it's not just capitalism, it's kind of crony capitalism. It's not just government stepping back and leaving it to the private sector. It's government spending billions of dollars on the private sector instead of delivering housing itself. And so we're actually spending more money than we've ever spent on housing. When I say we, I mean the federal government, and we're getting the worst results we've ever gotten.
Yeah. A lot of this discussion will be talking about taxation and tax concessions and matters that can seem quite kind of dry and technical on the surface. So before we go any further, I just want you to paint us a picture of how the lack of affordable housing is playing out right now, how it actually affects real people and their lives right now, how it impacts on homelessness, or how it traps women, for example, in dangerous relationships because they can't afford to leave the home that they're in. Can you just talk a bit about that for us?
I find this such an overwhelming question because people are affected in so many different ways. Our campaign hears from people who are on the really extreme side of the housing crisis, people who are doing things like sleeping in cars, sleeping in tents, people who have been evicted, can't afford a rental and just have no idea what to do and no idea what to tell their children about, what's going to happen and where they're going. Those are the really extreme stories. But there are also much more everyday stories. We held something called a People's Commission. We held a People's Commission into Australia's housing crisis last year. And some of the most common stories that we heard were people just having to move about once a year because they were served with these huge rent increases and they couldn't afford to keep up with them. We heard from people who had moved. We heard from one family, actually, who had moved 7 times in 7 years. And the woman, Lucy, who was telling us this story, was saying that she had just found a rental that was pretty far away from where they'd been living, so her kids were going to have to change schools. Every year they had been moving, and she said to her kids when they arrived at this new rental, right, we're finally home. This is where we're going to live. And her kids didn't even believe her because they were so used to moving so constantly. So there's all sorts of different ways that this problem is affecting people, from really unthinkable ways, where people can't even get their life going. Really, if you're living in a car, there's so many things that you can't do, and you're just locked out of permanently, through to these more everyday effects.
Yeah, some of these people are people with full-time jobs who can't afford to rent a house, often in the regional areas that they're living in, and they're living in tents and caravans.
Yeah, that's right. You mentioned the essential worker research that we did a couple of years ago. We actually had a report that just came out a couple of days ago, which looked at people who were on incomes between $40,000 and $130,000. So $40,000 a year, 50, 60, 70, all the way up to $130,000. And I think we can all agree, if you're earning $130,000 a year, you're pretty comfortable. But we found that in capital cities around the country, you basically have to be earning $130,000 a year to keep your housing costs under 30%, which is pretty insane. In many parts of the country, you have to be earning $100,000 a year just to afford the average rent and keep it under 50% of your income.
Yeah.
So it's pretty dire.
Look, I'm a journalist. I've been around for a while. I've been reporting on housing for an extremely long time. And despite all the talk of the great Australian dream slipping away, and the great Australian dream seems to have been slipping away for decades now, notwithstanding the fact that it is extremely bad at the moment. Despite this, despite governments pledging action, despite the media being obsessed really with real estate and housing prices and interest rates, despite all of that, the perception is things are not improving. Is that a fair perception? And if it is, why aren't they improving?
It's absolutely true that things aren't improving. Things are getting worse all the time, and it's really accelerated in the past couple of years. You look at rents and house prices since the pandemic started, the COVID pandemic started, and things have only gotten worse, and they haven't really improved. You get one quarter in Australia where rents maybe don't grow as much as they did in the previous quarter, and every commentator suddenly goes up in arms and says, "Oh my God, everything is slowing down," which is pretty insane as it is this idea that you can expect, baked in rental growth at astronomical rates quarter after quarter, and anything less than that is quote unquote slowing down is pretty mental. But the fact is, the government has almost no footprint in this area. Its footprint in this area is getting smaller and not getting bigger. And as a direct result of that, we're seeing the situation get worse as we become more and more dependent on the private market.
Is the private market and adjustments to the private market, adjustments to incentives in the private market, is that going to get us out of this crisis, or do we need to look at this in an entirely different way? Because at the moment, all of the solutions, to the extent that they exist, proposed solutions, are about market mechanisms. Is there another way?
There is another way, and we've done it before. And the good news there, this is the thing that makes me really optimistic. Everything we have ever needed to do in Australia to fix the housing crisis has been done here in this country before. The only difference today is that we are a richer country than we've ever been. So we can do it again. The government built social housing from the ground up. It used to build 30,000 homes a year pretty consistently for a long time. We can go back to doing that. There is no reason we can't go back to that. I'm a little bit allergic to, quote unquote, innovative solutions. I speak at a lot of events and speak to a lot of journalists, and everybody wants to ask me about tiny homes on wheels and, all sorts of things that are actually pretty niche. These things might be helpful on a small scale, but they aren't going to end the crisis writ large. Only the government can do that by changing the tax system that we've got, because we've really got the wrong people in Australia supplying housing. We are extremely dependent on hobby investors to supply what is really an essential service. I think everyone would agree housing is an essential service and an essential public good. And at the same time, we've got the government stepping further and further away. I think it really suits them to have a narrative where all they need to do in this space is make it possible for the private sector to build more, and then blame other levels of government when that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I think that's a version of the story that really works for them. And I think a challenge for a campaign like ours, like the Everybody's Home campaign, is to change that story and put more pressure on them to do more.
Well, according to Australia Institute research, negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount costs the budget around $20 billion a year. That's more than twice the $8.4 billion that state and territory governments spend on public and community housing. That's the number from last year. We could spend that $20 billion differently. We could phase that capital gains tax concession and negative gearing benefit out. But the argument that you hear against that, and I'm sure you've heard this argument many times, is that this would decimate the private rental market as investors fled the market, sold and got out, and that would leave an enormous shortage of rentals that would push rents up and make the situation even worse.
Yeah, that is a version of the story that has been told by the property sector for a long time and the lobby groups that represent landlords and investors. Again, it's a version of the story that really suits them. If you think about this for more than about 5 minutes, right? If an investor sells a house, it doesn't dematerialize. They are selling it to a person who is going to live in it, which is a good thing for the people who want to buy, who want to be owner-occupiers. I think the other thing to know is that if you're going to have the government step up, one of our key calls is for the government to build 940,000 homes over the next 20 years, nearly 1 million. This is only a problem if you're not replacing those private investors with something else. And our proposal is not just that you wind back these tax breaks, but also that the government steps up and starts treating housing as an essential service again. I think the other thing to know is that while this is a big capital investment, it doesn't mean it's an unsustainable investment. I live in the ACT, which used to be about 70% social housing, public housing, as it was back then. And it was mostly public servants living in those homes, and they were pretty high income earners paying market rent. The system was actually a lot more sustainable back then than it is now, when it's only delivering a small number of homes to people who aren't paying a lot into the system. So yes, it costs money to build housing, but that doesn't mean that this is an unsustainable system to maintain once you get there. The real key is making it an option for more people and bringing in more market renters.
On the other hand, we have had these arrangements in place since, I think, about the 80s, the incentive for private property investors to buy houses to rent. They then write off the losses on their property. And in theory, this, as we say, in theory, this creates more housing. We know that isn't working. And on top of that, the money they make from selling the house at a profit is taxed at a concessional rate as well. That's the so-called capital gains tax concession. This has created not just the problem that we're talking about now, but it's also created a culture of ingrained investor handouts that's very difficult to shake. How do we turn this around? How do we basically change people's expectations, because they're now kind of almost expecting these tax benefits from the government?
That challenge isn't a challenge for government, or not just for government. It's really a challenge for campaigners and campaigns like ours, because what we need to do is build the political power of people who want to live in housing and people who want affordable housing, and make those people more powerful and more important in debates than investors. There are actually more of us than there are of them, but they dominate the debate, and that's the thing that we need to change.
I'm Paul Barclay. I'm talking to Maiy Azize, National Spokesperson for Everybody's Home, a campaign to fix Australia's housing crisis. Maiy is also the Deputy Director of Anglicare Australia, and May's chapter on tackling the housing crisis is in What's the Big Idea?, an anthology of big ideas put together by the Australia Institute. You can purchase it right now. It also features chapters by Michael Kirby, Peter Doherty, Louise Adler, Fiona Stanley, and other leading thinkers. Solutions to our big challenges, they exist. We just need the courage to implement them. What's the Big Idea? Available online from the Australia Institute website. Maiy, it's often said that there's a major shortage of houses and apartments in Australia, a supply crisis, and economics tells us that scarcity pushes prices up for buyers and renters. If we had more supply, this would push prices down. But you write, and you rarely hear this talked about, that Australia has never had more houses per person than it has now. Can we say then that this is an issue that's not so much about a housing shortage, but an inequity in how houses are distributed?
I think that's spot on, Paul. That's exactly what I would say. I did quite a baffling event about a year ago with a housing academic, and it was an event for philanthropists. We're basically trying to get philanthropists interested in supporting our campaign, which was surprisingly not the easiest thing to do. A lot of these philanthropists directly benefit from these tax concessions themselves, and apparently don't want to get rid of them, so fair enough. But an academic spoke before me, and he had all these charts, and he was sort of presenting about how we're actually doing pretty well on supply. Supply has been outpacing population for the past 30 years. He had comparisons to other comparable countries, OECD countries, where we're doing pretty well, homes per person. And when you look at homes per adult, because we've got quite a young population in Australia compared to other countries, we're doing really well, actually, on housing supply. And then he had this, I guess it was confusion at the end, where he was like, so where does this crisis come from? And he seemed to be genuinely asking it. And he was saying, I think what we've got is a mismatch where some people have, more housing than they need, and other people don't have enough. And so, that's the real problem. And I thought, what an unusual framing, because if we were talking about wealth or income, we wouldn't be scratching our heads and saying this is a bit of a mismatch. Gosh, there's a mismatch where some people have more income and wealth than they need and other people don't have enough. We would be saying that's inequality. And I think we really shy away from that. We've been conditioned against that in housing. Again, it's a convenient frame for government, where if we just get the private sector to build more, this problem goes away. So it suits them, and obviously it suits developers in the industry who want to build more. But it is true, we have never had more homes per person. We certainly could build more. I don't want to sound like I oppose more supply. I think more supply and more abundant housing would be a good thing. I think the people who are proponents of that have the right ideas about urban design and densification and how our cities could grow more sustainably. Where I'm a bit more sceptical is this idea that if we just make it possible for the private sector to build more, that they will deliver homes that are affordable. That hasn't been our experience in Australia.
Yeah, and the other point to make here about the tax system is that it's working exactly as it is designed to work. If you give people an incentive to invest in something and then you say to them, the profits that you make will be taxed at a concessional rate, the income that you make will be offset against the other expenditure that goes into that investment into the home, then you are going to get people who find investing in housing, basically, that is a very good and cost-effective investment. The problem, of course, is that it's more effective for them. It's easier for them to buy that house than in many instances it is for an owner-occupier.
That's exactly right. I never use the phrase the system is broken. I know some housing advocates and campaigners do. This is a system that is working the way it was designed to work, and it's delivering results that can be expected. I think there's actually no better example of this than the short stay rental phenomenon. You know, you have all these state and territory governments and local governments around the country looking at ways that they can regulate this, trying to impose levies, and you have journalists and commentators really scratching their heads about how we can do something about this, and they all ignore the really obvious fact that you can claim negative gearing tax deductions and the capital gains tax discount on short stay listings in the same way that you can for normal rental accommodation. And in fact, those deductions are such a boon for holiday homes. You can claim artwork, you can claim the cleaning expenses after an Airbnb listing. They can be vacant for much of the year if you're functionally using it as a holiday home. They just need to be listed. It doesn't matter if the Victorian government or the ACT government imposes a small levy. The fact is it's never going to outweigh how lucrative these tax benefits are, and it's a bit weird to me that nobody is looking at the obvious contributor.
The government's also blaming immigration for the housing crisis. It's cut the international student intake accordingly. Is there any evidence that this is the case, or that the cut, which will impact university funding, another issue entirely, is there any evidence that this will actually help address the housing supply, housing affordability issue?
So housing supply has been outpacing population growth, including immigration, for decades now. But it's particularly ineffectual when it comes to international students. International students are the obvious place for governments to do crackdowns, and it's where they've been announcing a kind of succession of crackdowns over the past year and a half. But international students tend to live in dedicated student accommodation, which don't count in our dwelling numbers. When they live in student accommodation, they're actually not competing in the private rental market with other renters. And those who do rent in the private rental market, there aren't that many of them, but those who do overwhelmingly join existing households. They're not going off and renting their own place. That's quite rare. So it doesn't have the impact that decision makers lead us to believe. I mean, having said that, the other week I had a friendly discussion about this with Alan Kohler, who's got a pretty different view. He thinks the real issue with international students is that they don't leave, and it's not the issue of housing them while they're here as students. It's more the fact that they tend to stay and become permanent residents. But look, I think it is an overstated problem. As I said, this is really an argument about supply, right?
Yeah.
If you're saying that there's a problem with immigration, you're saying it's a demand and supply problem. Well, the obvious question is, why aren't all of the homes that we have been building over the last 10 years making housing cheaper, if that's what this is about? If I could actually say one more thing about immigration, there was an obvious natural experiment around this. We had about 2 years in Australia where all of the international students were pretty much forced out and no immigrants were coming in. Housing didn't get cheaper to rent or to buy. It only got more expensive. So, I think that tells you all you need to know.
And in terms of how much housing we need to build and to meet the unmet demand for those people who would qualify for public social housing, whatever you'd like to call it, what is that number? How many houses and how much would it cost?
So there's a few different numbers. There's over 200,000 Australians who are on waiting lists for social housing. However, there are 640,000 people who need it. That doesn't mean – so there's more people who need it than are on waiting lists. Waiting lists in many parts of the country are more than 10 years. It makes total sense that you're not going to spend 10 years on a waiting list. A lot of people just don't even believe that they'll ever get one and don't put their name down for it. In the next 20 years, that number is set to grow to 940,000. These are estimates from the University of New South Wales. So our campaign is calling on the government to build 940,000 homes over the next 20 years to get ahead of that demand. What I would actually love to see over the longer term is to make social housing an option for more Australians, not just the ones who meet current eligibility criteria, because that's how you bring down costs for everybody. And as I said, that's actually how you make the system more sustainable, by bringing in more market renters who pay into the system. I'm recording this here in the Australia Institute offices, and my friends at the Australia Institute love talking about defence housing. This is basically how defence housing works. It's rentals provided to public servants who pay a market rent.
And 940,000 new homes, that's a fair whack of capital required to build them by the government. Is there public support for government investing in more public and social housing?
This is actually the most popular thing that governments could do. The Guardian Essential poll, I think at the end of last year, did a poll of housing solutions, and social housing is the thing that was actually the most widely supported. I should say changing the tax system was also a lot more widely supported than people realise. But social housing is the most popular thing that you can do.
And we are seeing the government committing a tiny bit to building some more community and public housing. Are they showing any signs that they might be prepared to go further down this road? I know that there was a bit of a stoush between the Greens and the government over this, and the Greens managed to eke a little bit more out of the government, but still I'm thinking that what you're saying is not enough to make any kind of noticeable impact.
So the government made a $2 billion commitment through something called the Social Housing Accelerator, which that was actually the biggest one-off investment in social housing since the global financial crisis. So it's nothing to sneeze at. The issue is that they need to be doing something like that every single year, every single year to build the amount of housing that we need. I think there's been an encouraging, I would say, change in language. Claire O'Neill, who's been the minister since last year, has been talking a lot about how the government used to be in this space in a big way and needs to get back into it. What we're now waiting to see is, I guess, an announcement or a commitment from them that matches the scale of the crisis. I would say this government is doing things that are good for small numbers of people. So, a Help to Buy scheme for 10,000 people, Housing Australia Future Fund, which will build 30,000 homes. Remember, we've got a shortfall of 640,000. I wouldn't want to get in the way of one of those people who could get one of those 30,000 homes. But what we need to see them do is scale up their ambition to match the scale of the crisis.
In terms of making housing more affordable for young people to buy, that's going to require housing coming down in price. And it's almost a national sport in Australia, watching the value of house prices increase if you own a house. Now, if houses were cheaper, more young people could buy them. That would be a good thing for society. They'd have housing tenure and security. Would Australians, do you think, support the value of their houses falling if it meant that more people had access to the ability to buy a home?
I think they would. And I think the thing that's kind of obviously it would be bad for investors, but I think even for owner-occupiers, this could be a really good thing. I'm an elder millennial, and so I've got a mix of different friends, friends who are renting, friends who are maybe, just sort of buying for the first time. And I've got a couple of friends who've started families and they're moving out of their apartments and trying to find something that's family friendly, whether it's a bigger apartment or, a townhouse or something like that. And they want to sell the place that they're in for a good return, but that's because they want to afford the next place. It's not just because it's not this mania for housing investment.
Well, people buy and sell in the same market. So
exactly.
if one category of housing is falling, so is the other, and it's a paper loss, really. It doesn't amount to much in reality.
Yeah, exactly. I've got a cousin who I remember talking to about. A couple of years ago, he bought a place in the early 2000s and it's now in Sydney and it's now incredibly valuable. And I said, oh, that's pretty exciting. You could sell it. And then he said, well, no, because then I'd have to buy somewhere else to live. And that's not going to be, I'm not exactly out on top if I do that.
Yeah. So if we have a significantly increased number of Australians who are going to rent all the way through to their retirement, all the way through until they die, does this require a change in policy to adapt our settings to that newer reality in Australia? I mean, we still seem to talk about Australians being home buyers and that being an aspiration, but clearly it's not going to be a reality for an increasing number of people. Do we need to change some of our policies as a result?
We do, and this is where you can get the most immediate results. You know, the big investment in social housing that I'm talking about, that will take time. I mean, it took us decades to whittle away all of the housing that governments used to own, and it'll take time to build it back up again to get it to where it needs to be. So that's not necessarily a solution for people tomorrow. But what you can do is put some limits on rent increases, and people will benefit from that immediately. We're a real outlier in the world. In most parts of the world, it's actually not legal to raise rents by more than about 2%. That's a fairly standard rule in other countries, other comparable countries. Australia and New Zealand are actually pretty unique in the sort of policy settings that we have. Interestingly, though, we have had rent controls in Australia in some of our biggest states up until the 60s and 70s. I am telling you, everything we've ever needed to do, we have done before. You know, we've chosen. Governments have chosen the system that we have, which is perhaps baffling. But yes, we absolutely do need to protect renters. There are going to be people who are going to be renting for life, and they ought to have stability, predictability, and basic protections. By the way, if I could add one more thing, this works pretty well in the commercial real estate sector. If you're renting commercial real estate, you agree to what your rent increases are going to be at the start of your term. Your lease might be 5 years long. You're allowed to make pretty substantial changes to the place that you're renting. You could even do renovations if you agree to them with your landlords. There is no reason why residential rentals can't work in the same way.
Yeah. Great to talk to you, Maiy. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Maiy Azize, National Spokesperson for Everybody's Home, a campaign to fix Australia's housing crisis. Maiy is the Deputy Director of Anglicare Australia. The Australia Institute believes in big ideas and delivering research that matters, but we can't do it all alone. We need people like you who understand that real change doesn't come from playing it safe. That's why we're asking for your support. You can sign up to our mailing list to get involved. And if you have the means, you can also donate to ensure we can keep fighting for a better, cleaner, fairer Australia. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.